1, 2, 3. 3 count 4.
Hello everyone, I am Be Better Gamer and welcome to Be Better Gamer Wrestling. This channel is dedicated to the classic series of N64 wrestling games developed by Acolytes Corporation, which, if you are unfamiliar, were WCW NWO World Tour, WCW NWO Revenge, Virtual Pro Wrestling 64, Virtual Pro Wrestling 2, WWF WrestleMania 2000, and WWF No Mercy. Thank you for clicking on this video, and I hope you stick around. I am playing WWF No Mercy. It's the 5th part of my No Mercy Tag Team Championship path, where I am playing as Bradshaw and Farooq, aka the APA, the Acolytes Protection Agency. If you're joining me for the first time, in my Let's Plays I like to talk about the Aki games as well as explore the historical context of what was going on in WWE/F circa the time No Mercy was released, which was in November of 2000. I am playing as the Acolytes because they were the 3-time tag team champions, 2 times as the Acolytes, 1 as the APA, and the subtitle for this episode is The Ballad of the APA. I wanted to include the APA in my Tag Team Championship Let's Play series for 2 reasons. One, both Bradshaw and Farooq had impressive singles careers before and after the APA, as well as less notable or prestigious tag team factions careers before the success of the APA. And specifically, actually, Bradshaw was probably less notable with his tag team stuff, but Farooq actually was part of notable tag teams and factions before the APA. So I wanted to talk about that stuff, but also, when I think of No Mercy, when I think of playing the game No Mercy and doing the championship paths, I think of the APA. I think of all the handicap matches that you have to have between the APA. I think of the backstage areas which were introduced in No Mercy. They weren't in 2000, they weren't in Revenge. Specifically the bar and the locker room, and I think they were modeled after the scenes involving the APA, the skits and vignettes involving the Acolytes Protection Agency. So I had to include them because honestly I loved the APA. I loved the skits and the whole storyline revolving around them being these guns for hire who was just drinking and playing cards backstage, and they loved to people up. So and they love to beat people up. They didn't love people up. And they figured they should start charging for it. So there I was. If you just saw, I just had to lose the first match, get myself DQ'd, because in this path you got to lose the first 2 matches, win the 3rd one, and then win the rest of them pretty much. But there's a lot of... So this path has a lot of shenanigans. It's a pretty easy path, and actually I don't remember what these paths are beforehand. So when I chose the APA, it just so happened to be that this path kind of fits perfectly with who the APA are, and you're gonna see that a bit. There are a few too many single matches in this Let's Play for my liking. Like I said in my previous Tag Team Championship Let's Plays, I get frustrated with the Tag Team Championship path because they do so much stuff storyline wise, and it forces you to play a lot of single matches, or you'll lose your partner that you started with. Like last episode I did Rock and Sock, and I ended up winning the Tag Team Championship with Stevie Richards and Mankind. So it's kind of annoying to me. It's not exactly a deal breaker. I mean, you're still playing the game, but we'll talk about a little bit of that. But yeah, getting back to the APA, the concept is just brilliant. I'm surprised it's never been sort of repeated. I mean, it would very clearly be copying the APA, just a bunch of guys sitting backstage, drinking, playing cards, and then people threw money at them to go beat people up. But the way I always kind of saw it was referencing sort of what used to happen a lot in the 80s, where there used to be storylines where bounties would be put on other wrestlers. So like, let's say you had your baby face, and the bad guy, he was the champion, the heel, he was the champion. He would put a bounty on the baby face, so you would have other bad guys from other promotions come in to try to take them out, because they'll win like $10,000. The main heel champion would pay them money if they were able to beat up the baby face or hurt them to a point where they couldn't challenge the heel for his title. So The APA sort of kind of remind me about that, but they had no allegiances, they had no alliances. It's that whoever came in said they needed protection and had the money up front for the most part, they would do it. And it resulted in a lot of comedic scenes, a lot of comedic bits, but you also got to see the APA do what they did best, and that's just beat people up. Bradshaw and Faarooq were two physically intimidating wrestlers, and they had a very rough, intense style that was frankly fun to watch. It's always fun to watch, just especially with tag teams, which is the theme of this whole series. It's fun to watch the different dynamics between tag teams and what you could do with a tag team that you probably couldn't do with a solo wrestler. And I think the tandem of having two big guys that are hard to beat is a lot easier to get across than just one guy. You run into a lot of issues because eventually when that one guy is beat, it's just kind of like a slippery slope from there where, how many times are they going to lose? Who are they going to lose to? This and that. Who can actually beat them? Whereas a tag team, you have two guys, you can get away with a whole lot more, keep them protected, and also still have them be a threat to baby faces and make the baby faces look even better because they're overcoming two guys as opposed to one. So I don't know, I just feel like there's a lot more you can do with tag teams in general. But WWF, as I mentioned in my other Let's Plays, their history of tag teams in the tag team division is a little all over the place. But the APA came in a good time. But before they became the APA, sort of like how I talked about in the New Age Outlaws Let's Play, Bradshaw and Faarooq became a tag team sort of randomly, not having any real association previously in the WWF before they became a tag team. I mean, we would come to find out they were best friends behind the scenes, so that's probably why they started teaming together, really. But character-wise, Bradshaw was in the WWF since 1995. So when he was first introduced, he was a single wrestler, Justin Hawk Bradshaw, if you remember. I remember him. He used to come out kind of like a cowboy-ish gimmick, and he would brand people with his branding iron after the match, and they would have his initials, JB, and Dutch Mantel was his manager, known as Uncle Zebekiah. So he was his manager, and it didn't last long. He would then become a part of a tag team with Barry Windham, and they were called the New Blackjacks. New because the original Blackjacks were Blackjack Mulligan and Blackjack Lanza. Mulligan was the father of Barry Windham, real life father of Barry Windham and Kendall Windham, another wrestler, and famous wrestler I should say, and is the father-in-law of Mike Rotunda, IRS, if you don't know who Mike Rotunda is. And Mike Rotunda is the dad of Bray Wyatt and Bo Dallas, so he was the grandfather of Bray Wyatt and Bo Dallas. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. The Blackjacks, the original Blackjacks, were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2006, and Bradshaw was called Blackjack Bradshaw, and Windham was called Blackjack Windham. This tag team did not go off. It did not reach the success maybe as the original Blackjacks. So then the next time you would see Bradshaw as part of a tag team was when he was introduced as part of the Acolytes with Faarooq, and they were managed by the Jackal. If you don't remember the Jackal, there was Don Callis. You might remember him as Cyrus in ECW. He had a brief stint in WWF as the Jackal. He managed the Acolytes. He was the one who originally introduced them as a tag team on camera, and he was released by the company, but the Acolytes stayed on, and they would join the Undertaker's ministry stable. So here's the first. So now I'm working for Shane McMahon. So here's the first singles match. I'm actually not in the match. I have to help Shane win the match. So I come in, interference. Apparently there's no DQ, and I just help beat up Rikishi. So since this is the tag team championship path, like I said, I like to skip all the non-tag team matches, but there's Shane. But it's very fitting about the APA being these guns for hire, and now Shane is calling in my services. And I chose Faarooq because I planned on doing something with Bradshaw down the line, maybe another Let's Play or championship paths. But to be honest, I like doing the Dominator. I love the Dominator. It's one of my favorite moves to do in the game. It just looks so brutal and devastating, and even in real life when Faarooq would do it. But in game, I don't know, for me, it has one of my favorite animations. And speaking of Faarooq, Ron Simmons, if you know, as he's his real name he goes by, he was introduced in WWF as Faarooq Assad, this like gladiator kind of gimmick where he wore like a blue gladiator helmet, and he was managed by Sonny, and he feuded with Ahmed Johnson. But before that, he was Ron Simmons. He wrestled for WCW and NWA from 1984 to 1997, where he was also part of another great tag team with Butch Reed known as Doom. They would feud with the Steiners, with the Horsemen, and a bunch of other tag teams. And the tag team scene in the 80s, definitely in the NWA, WCW promotions, and including Japan, had some of the best tag teams, and Doom was right up there with them. So if you have the WWE Network, you have to watch Doom. You have to go see how powerful and big, and sort of a precursor to the Acolytes in a way, in terms of their style and how intimidating they were. After splitting with Reed, Ron Simmons would achieve the biggest singles moment in his career, where he would defeat Vader for the WCW Championship on August 2nd, 1992. He was the first African American champion in WCW, and WWE recognized him as the first African American world champion ever in the history of wrestling. Technically, this is and isn't accurate because Bobo Brazil won the title, won the NWA championship in 1962 from Killer Kowalski, but I'm not too sure on the details. But for whatever reason, NWA doesn't officially recognize this title reign because it happened at a time where Buddy Rogers, who was the champion, lost it to Kowalski, but apparently Buddy Rogers lost it under an injury, so a lot of people thought he didn't really lose it because Kowalski took advantage of that. And then Bobo Brazil didn't want to accept it after he beat Kowalski because he was like, no, this originally belongs to Buddy Rogers. He got injured. Buddy Rogers would come back and face Kowalski and Bobo Brazil on separate occasions and beat them and regain his title, quote unquote. But the NWA doesn't officially recognize Bobo Brazil's reign, so I guess that's why WWE goes ahead and says, yeah, Faarooq was the first ever world champion. Either way you look at it, still a very important and monumental moment in the history of wrestling, and of course a lot of significance to that. And he only held it for 5 months though, so it was a very short reign. He would lose it back to Vader, and he would turn heel again because he was babyface for that world championship run, and he was heel for his time with Doom. And he would leave WCW in 94, making a brief pit stop at ECW, and then joining WWF in 1996. So in this match right here, you see I made my way to the boiler room because the stipulation was you gotta bring Rikishi to the back and beat him up, and then Bradshaw out of nowhere comes in, and now it's become a 2-on-1. So if you were wondering, hey, he's playing a singles match, why is that? Well, it was because I knew Bradshaw was coming, so I decided to keep it, and we're just gonna watch Bradshaw and Faarooq beat the crap out of Rikishi. I gotta say, like, playing as the Acolytes is so much fun. I don't know why it is, for me at least. I always loved playing as them, and I guess maybe when No Mercy came out, because I was such a fan of the APA and like the skits they would do backstage, I appreciated them even more because there's just something about their moveset and about this mentality of these two, destructive members of this tag team just manhandling everyone. It's so much fun to play, and this is where I enjoy going backstage. I normally don't go backstage for, like, if I'm doing my own matches with my own character or other wrestlers, but with the APA, I'll gladly go backstage and try to hit as many finishers and clothesline from hells and dominators as possible. So that's what's happening here, in case you were wondering. It's kind of fun. I like it. I mean, again, but it makes it come so easy. As you can see, a lot of the matches in this championship path are handicap matches. There you go, hitting the big dominator on Rikishi, just bouncing off the concrete. But getting back to Faarooq, when he would come into WWF as Faarooq Assad in that weird gladiator gimmick, that wouldn't last too long, because then he would become the leader of the infamous Nation of Domination. And I mean, this was a stable that could have very well, pushed Faarooq into the top of the WWE card. And he had a championship match with Undertaker that headlined one of the pay-per-views back in the day. But if they only hadn't invited The Rock or Rocky Maivia to join in, maybe things would have gone differently. But when Rocky Maivia joined the Nation, well, he became The Rock, and the rest is history. So they would kick Faarooq out of the Nation, but Faarooq had a lot of success with the Nation, and that really was his claim to fame in WWF before the Acolytes. And when he came out with Bradshaw, and it was a completely different look. They had like these like markings on their tights, and the markings on the chest, and they were working for the Undertaker as part of the Ministry of Darkness, and it was sort of like a cult. Like they were supposed to be like a cult, and they would have, and if you played WrestleMania 2000, or if you watched early Attitude Era WWE, you knew one of the biggest storylines was like the Ministry of Darkness, and Faarooq and Bradshaw were kind of the muscle of that group. And I think that's when they really came into their own as a tag team, and everyone really got to see these guys who had been in the WWF for a few years. Now they really got to see what they're capable of, because as a tag team, they were so dominating, were so intimidating, and you couldn't like deny it. These two guys come out, and like, yeah, maybe they look kind of silly with the tattoos on their chest, but once they got in there and the way they would beat people up and throw them around, it was fun to watch, and you could tell people were getting into it and realizing they were a threat. You go back and watch a lot of the Raw episodes where the Acolytes were featured as the force that came in to help Undertaker and to help, beat up guys. They were pretty threatening. Eventually, they would split from the Ministry and go off on their own. But as the Acolytes, they would win the tag team titles twice, even though they had really short reigns. The first time they won, they defeated Kane and X-Pac for the titles on an episode of Raw, which aired May 31st of 1999. I get a lot of requests for Kane and X-Pac, and maybe I already, like I said early in the episode, I've already recorded all the championship paths. I did not use Kane and X-Pac, but maybe I'll do a bonus path later on because so many people want to see me play as Kane and X-Pac. Definitely fan favorites from that tag team time. And there I went doing a really fast count as Faarooq. Now you're a special guest, which is basically another handicap match. That's what that was. So again, I just breezed by it because if it's not a handicap match with Bradshaw, I'm not showing it. But then they would lose the titles to the Hardys after winning it from Kane and X-Pac in an upset that I talked about in my Hardy Boys Let's Play, where this was the beginning of the Hardy Boys' rise in the tag team division. So the Acolytes were there. The Acolytes were there at the beginning of it, and they were the power tag team that was around. You had Edge and Christian, you had the Hardys, and before the Dudleys show up, the Acolytes were kind of the power team that everyone feared and would get beat up by. So they would regain the titles back from the Hardys at Fully Loaded 1999, 2 weeks later. This happened at the Marine Midland Arena in Buffalo, which is now the KeyBank Center, which is the home base currently of Be Better Gamer. So that's kind of neat, and just thought I'd mention that. And they would lose the championship back to Kane and X-Pac on August 1999. So that was really their time with the tag team championship. Again, for this team, the reason why I chose them wasn't because of their championship accomplishments, but I just took Jericho's head off right there with Faarooq. He's got that big left clothesline. Faarooq obviously does the clothesline from hell, which is another great animation in this game. But what's funny is that Bradshaw's moves, if you haven't played Virtual Pro Wrestling 2, they're basically the animations that Kobashi uses. Kobashi uses that big clothesline from hell, and then his finisher is the big clothesline. Bradshaw basically has those same clotheslines, so it's kind of interesting that with the same animation you can establish these two completely different wrestlers. So I think that's kind of cool. There I go, big boom, single leg powerbomb, which was introduced in No Mercy. It wasn't in WrestleMania 2000. It might have been in Virtual Pro Wrestling 2. I can't remember right now. I should have looked it up, but whatever. It wasn't in WrestleMania 2000. It was in No Mercy. Another move I love to use as Faarooq. Pump handle stand. Like, look at this. It's like Jericho has no chance. And then you wonder why the matches playing against the Acolytes are so hard, playing against the APAs, because when you plays them, you realize, holy crap, their moveset is just like unstoppable. Here you go, double power bomb. Just love it. It feels good to be on the other side of the fence for once. It feels good to be dishing out the punishment. If you watch my other Let's Plays, or even if you play the championship path yourself, in all of them, and pretty much all of them, you always end up facing the APA, sometimes multiple times in the path, sometimes multiple times throughout a whole championship series. So it can be kind of not frustrating, but you definitely have to be on your game for those matches, because I think they spike the difficulty level up, and no matter what, no matter how good you are, you can't sleep on a handicap match, because if the momentum goes against you, it's pretty much a wrap. I mean, just look at how easily we're able to, bam, clothesline from hell, knockout punch, knockout move right there from Jericho, picks him back up. I mean, just look how easily we're able to, and I'm just working with the computer to dominate Chris Jericho. A lot of it obviously has to do with timing. I know when to time, when to grab, because I can sense when the computer's gonna grab. And right now I'm just letting Bradshaw do his thing, because the momentum is just completely in our favor, and there's no way he's getting up. Just squashing Jericho right now. It's so much fun. It's so much. If you've never played as the Acolytes in No Mercy, do it, because it's just so much fun. It's so much fun. And that was what they were known for, their brutal and physical wrestling style. They would wreck a lot of the lower card tag teams, especially. I think they would know, like, oh yeah, these guys are probably never coming back, so let's just rip their head off and make ourselves look strong. Nobody took a clothesline from hell better than Jeff Hardy, in my opinion, every time they would face the Hardy Boys. Especially he would take a lot of them in the air. You know, half the time he'd be falling towards Bradshaw, and Bradshaw would just clock him with the clothesline from hell. They had an infamous match with Public Enemy on Sunday Night Heat, aired March 7th, 1999. You actually can just see it on the WWE's YouTube channel. Just, you know, search APA Public Enemy. And apparently they had disagreements with Public Enemy before the match. JBL cited on one of his blogs about Public Enemy's poor attitude and lateness to the event, as well as not wanting to cooperate on the angle or finish. So they basically took matters in their own hand, and they were like, you know what, well, we're gonna make them do what they need to do, and which is basically they need to get beat up by us. So they're not gonna be able to disagree with us. So how could you disagree with them? If you watch that match, it's I wouldn't say it's scary to watch, but because it doesn't turn into like one of those like shoot matches where guys get busted open and bloody because they're really punching them in the face. But they're definitely imposing their will on Public Enemy, and Public Enemy is just taking it and, you know, just hitting them with chairs and stairs. The ref is not calling for DQ because the ref doesn't know what's going on. He's like, wait, is this what we're doing? I don't know how to react. So, but it's just another example of when they were let loose, they were a great tag team, but, you know, they didn't become that dominant tag team, that dominant force like, let's say, Legion of Doom or Demolition in the past. You know, at that time, you had the rise of the Hardys, Edge and Christian, and then the Dudley Boys. So that's what really anchored the tag team division. And towards the end of 2000, they kind of fell off as the Acolytes. Obviously, the whole ministry angle had faded, and they were just kind of on their own. Their last appearance as the Acolytes was at the 2000 Royal Rumble, where they lost pretty quickly in a tag team match against the New Age Outlaws. It was a tag team championship match, and about a week later or so, there was a skit where the Mean Street Posse runs into the locker room where Bradshaw and Farooq are playing cards and just smoking cigars, and they're in a panic because they're getting chased and beat up and they need protection. So Bradshaw and Farooq tell them, you know, get out of here. They're like, no, we'll pay you. And they throw a bunch of money on the table. You know, the rich boys from Connecticut, they always have money in their pockets. And they throw a bunch of money on the table, and that brings a big idea into Bradshaw's head. And he's like, we can do this. We can make the Acolyte Protection Agency. We can go into the protection business. And then later on, the Dudleys come in seeking the same thing. They just had a fight with the Hardys, and they feel like they're being attacked. So they say the same thing. We'll pay you to go beat up the Hardys and, you know, show us the money up front, Faarooq says. and they don't have the money, but they'll pay by check. So that's always a funny joke to me. Oh, I don't have any cash, but I'll pay by check. And that was the birth of the APA. That was the birth of the Acolytes. They would go out later that night and attack the Hardys and just lay waste to them. And you can't be mad at them. You can't boo the APA because they're just basically guns for hire. And it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny that these guys, that they're just kind of minding their own business, smoking and playing cards, and then someone will just pay them money and they'll go beat someone up. So for the longest time, they were this heel tag team, but instantly almost they became baby faces. They became good guys because the fans just loved it when they came out. And what made it great too was that there was consistency throughout the universe of the of WWE, where within this world, and this doesn't happen a lot anymore, which is why I bring it up, which is why I talk about it. The consistency of this world, of all these wrestlers fighting to become champions, fighting to get ahead in the promotion, and there's these two guys that everyone in the locker room knows that they can just pay money to, and then they can do their bidding. It doesn't have to be some elaborate deception by like Vince McMahon and the ministry and the corporation or all this stuff. It doesn't have to be like, these backstabbing angles. It's just like, we just know two of the toughest guys in the back. If I give them some money, they'll take care of this problem for me, or they'll protect me. And it worked. It was so brilliant, and you couldn't have picked a two better team. Their bits would like. It was not only great to see them, get unleashed and just beat people up, but it was also great to see how far they took this whole bit. They would be backstage and they had this door that was just in a frame, but there was no walls, and people would go around the door to talk to them, and they'd be like, they'd pretend they didn't hear them come in, or they would yell at them and say, hey, use the door, or you have no manners or something. So people would have to walk back out, knock on the door, and come in, and then they would greet them like, oh, hey, yeah, come in, how you doing, what do you need? It was just hysterical to me. I love that. It's where we saw the birth of Faarooq's catchphrase, where he would go, damn, for every little thing, and it grew into this hugely popular thing. Whereas now, whenever Farooq shows up in his off appearances, that's usually what he shows up for. He just shows up at the end of a bit and he just says damn, and everyone laughs because it's funny. And they would also film scenes to go out to bars and drink, and then they would pick fights with people, or people rather would pick fights with them, and they would beat them up. So it was a fun. I liked it. It was fun character work because at least it created, you knew who these guys were. And that's always a big thing about wrestlers in general, but especially in tag teams, you knew who they were. They were there to make money and to beat people up. So they didn't necessarily have to go after the championships because they had the, they had the reputation of just going to them and paying them enough, and they could take care of any problem. And then they were protected too, because when they got paid to beat people up, those people would get beat up. And I think you have to establish that if you're going to have this group where it's like, all right, they're going to, Triple H is going to go to him to beat up The Rock or whatever. The Rock has to get beat up. The Rock can't come out of it, because then it would make the APA look weak, but also it would break that world. It would break that story of this heroes for, these guns for hire. I almost call them heroes for hire. I'm thinking of Marvel. And I kind of miss that. I don't miss the APA per se. I just miss the idea of the world behind the scenes that exists within the WWE continuity, which exists within the storylines. Because I know, behind the scenes these are real people, this and that, but I kind of miss that. What you saw in the ring, you saw the stories going on in the ring, but then you also saw stories going on backstage. Real quick, just when I was doing my research for, Razor Ramon, when I did my Razor Ramon call, which was uploaded, was the last upload I put up, so go check that out. There was a promo he was giving at one point, and he's talking, I think Mean Gene, he's talking to someone, and Bret Hart is escorted in front of him by the doctors. And it was real quick, it was real sudden, but it was basically a carryover from the previous match where Bret Hart got beat up pretty bad. And like, they acknowledged them, they acknowledged them, and Razor Ramon just kept on doing his promo. And it's like, just little things like that makes the storylines keep existing. So you imagine that backstage, once these wrestlers get off, you imagine that their world is still continuing backstage, so that when you do see those interviews, when you do see those promos that they're cutting backstage, it makes sense. It doesn't just feel like, oh, now it's this person's time to talk, and now it's this person's time to say this, or now they stage this whole big fight. It kind of seems out of place when they do it now, because they don't really do a great job of establishing who people are when they come out in the ring and who they are when they're, backstage. I think of like things like Bray Wyatt did recently, or a few months ago I should say, with his feud with Randy Orton, and Randy Orton would go backstage looking for him. Like, did we ever establish this idea that when Bray Wyatt walks around backstage, he can teleport and do all these things? So it becomes a little bit harder to believe, even though obviously it's wrestling, you gotta take it, for what it is. But I'm just thinking, if you want to elevate the storytelling a little bit more, it's the little details and subtleties like that you don't really see anymore. And honestly, the APA is kind of a masterclass in that. It's creating characters who establish a world outside of the locker room, and then, outside of the ring and into the locker room, so that when everyone interacts with them, you know where everyone is and where everyone stands. And they would interact with the Mean Street Posse all the way to The Rock. And it created this great world, and that's really what I loved about it, along with the comedic bits and the beating people up and the smoking and the drinking and all that stuff. That's really what I loved, was that it helped establish a foundation backstage that we don't really get anymore. Lucha Underground does a great job of establishing a world outside of the temple that carries over into what happens in the temple, and that's what for me adds to the storytelling of wrestling, because the most of the storytelling is told within the ring, but if you want to tell stories out of the ring, you have to build this consistent world, and Lucha Underground does that really well. New Japan doesn't really do too much of that. They usually will have their interviews, post-match interviews and stuff like that, but Lucha Underground does that really well. WWE used to do it well. They used to do it very well. And, NXT sort of does it well. NXT brings a little bit of that back, but at the same time, I don't know, NXT, I feel like they walk that fine line of, what's happening backstage and then what's happening in real life. So sometimes it's hard to establish, oh, is this a bit, or is this them being, a real person? Anyway, going back to the APA, that's my little tangent about the I don't know, underlying theme of the APA backstage skits where they're just drinking and playing cards. Of course, I create this whole thesis about why that matters in the sense of continuity and storytelling backstage. Of course, I would come up with something crazy like that. But as the APA, they did win the tag team championships at one point. They won an episode of SmackDown on July 9th, 2001, defeating the Dudleys. They would lose it about a month later, DDP and Canyon, and they got split up briefly during the draft, but would reunite after that, like in 2003. And their last time teaming was actually in a match against Scotty 2 Hotty and Rikishi, where the stipulation was that they would be fired if they lost, because Heyman was upset about them, laughing at him for being attacked by Stone Cold, I believe. And they lost the match. So Heyman actually just fired Faarooq and told Bradshaw that he could keep his job or he can get fired with Faarooq as well. And Faarooq saw the writing on the wall and he decided to just leave. And the rest was history, as they say, because Bradshaw would go on becoming a singles competitor, would become JBL, and he would leave his APA sort of gimmick behind him and become JBL, this businessman type wrestler, and would become world champion, a feud with Eddie Guerrero and John Cena and all that. And the real reason why they did that was because Faarooq was retiring. Faarooq obviously had been in the business a lot longer than Bradshaw, so he thought his time was up and he wanted to retire. So they went out losing to Scotty 2 Hotty and Bradshaw, but the legacy of APA always remained, because throughout the years you would see them brought back for a bunch of skits and being brought back as protection again, and they always got a good reaction when they come out, even now, because again it's that It's that idea of like, oh, this is a storyline. This is sort of like a cameo. Some of my favorite APA moments, I mean, I always love any bit involving the door. I always love when they would make people walk through the door or knock on the door or stuff like that. Or there was like one scene where they beat up a bunch of people in the office. And again, the office is just, you know, somewhere backstage. There's no walls, but you have that door, and they beat someone up and they're all over the place. And then they walk out, but they walk out the door and they close the door behind them. Like, it's like, that's funny. That's comedy to me. WWE, you know, sometimes they struggle with the comedy they do, but to me, that's funny. It's those little touches like that I find hysterical. And another favorite, I think my favorite APA hiring easily has to be when Taka Michinoku faced Triple H for the world title. Triple H was talking about how, you know, he was going to be a fighting champion and defend the title to like a worthy opponent, and ends up being Taka Michinoku. And this was like prime Triple H, you know, McMahon, Helmsley era Triple H. So he had the Outlaws and the Stooges, Briscoe and Patterson, and all that stuff. I think maybe even Boss Man. But Taka Michinoku came out, and he comes out with Funaki, and then all of a sudden the APA enter, and their music hits, and the crowd goes wild because now it's an even fight. Now Taka might have a chance because the APA are there to protect him, and that was just a great match. That's one of my favorite moments ever on Raw, was Taka Michinoku against Triple H. But having the APA added to it almost randomly out of nowhere, but it makes sense. You can do that. You can get away with it again because they established the storyline. Imagine, if you will, if we lived in a world where the Wyatts were still around. You know, I always remember, I'm kind of sour on the Wyatt family or Bray Wyatt in general because I always feel like they have some momentum and then disappear. But imagine, if you will, a world where, if you remember, I don't know if this was last year or 2 years ago, when Vince McMahon brought everyone out and all the wrestlers were standing on the ring, not the ring, like the Titantron, the entrance ramp area. Vince McMahon was talking to everyone, and then the Wyatt family thing hit, and then the lights come out, and they're standing on the announce table. They're standing outside of where everyone else is. So it's like, yeah, they're this you know, weird teleporting force that exists in WWE, but they're also still wrestlers employed under WWE, so they have to come out for these meetings. And you know, Bray Wyatt does his little shindig about how we won't bow down to the machine, blah blah blah. We've heard it a million times. It doesn't mean anything more now, but back then it was like always cool to hear. But I've kind of lost interest every time he talks about that because, again, the world hasn't been established. If you know what would be cool, if Bray Wyatt came out with the Wyatt family and talked about how he would rise up against the machine and go against the machine and do all these things, but then like would never fight for a championship, would just come in and mess stuff up, would just come in and mess with things because he can, because in this world that exists outside of the ring, in WWE, in the WWE locker room, they cause chaos. They mess up the machine. They don't want Roman Reigns to win the title, not because Bray Wyatt is just whatever, it's because they know it'll mess up the order. You know, they'll know it'll mess up the idea of what the people in charge want to go down in WWE. And you know, just establishing stuff like that, if you had groups of people, you know, that did stuff in WWE that was just kind of outside of like, oh, I'm mad at you, so I'm gonna beat you up. It's just like, you know, if we had that person who was a monster that was just released, you know, kind of how like Kane was at one point, and even what they tried to do with him a few years ago, where like if he wore his mask, you know, something what he would transform into the Demon Kane and something like that. It's gonna be interesting what they do with Finn Balor. How are they gonna work the Demon Balor in WWE and have it be different than what it was in NXT? Because I think the real strength of having a character like that in the Demon Balor is that you have to establish how that character exists in the world of WWE, of this wrestling promotion of wrestlers trying to, I don't know, win championships. Isn't that supposed to be the goal? And I know it might sound silly and crazy, and maybe I'm overthinking it, but if you go back and you look back at how some of the storylines were handled, you know, that we all remember. Think of one of your favorite storylines right now. Think about why it worked beyond the fact like, oh, person A and person B did a really good match in the ring. Obviously you need that, but think back to who was involved, who, like, everyone that was involved, everyone they came in contact with during that feud, how the matches went up leading up to the feud, what was the build, but also what was going on in the ring, but also outside of the ring. Were there any backstage events that happened, any promos cut outside of the ring or outside of, you know, the time when wrestling was supposed to be happening? Any like satellite at home interviews. Think of Stone Cold Steve Austin, Brian Pillman, Stone Cold going to the household, and that solidified how intense this feud became, and that would later, you know, transition into the feud between Stone Cold and the Hart Foundation, and how intense everything would get. Or when Triple H would do something similar to like that, when he would make the house calls, if you will. You know, but just think of those moments where the matches were enhanced by the story. And a lot of the times you'll find that the reason why the matches were enhanced by the story is because they took their time to craft a world where the storyline made sense existing in that world, and people had real motivations based on, you know, the actions or reactions that were going on within that feud. The APA, I'm trying to draw a major comparison here that I'm sure no one else draws. But the APA, I do believe, are a really good example of how to execute that well. They are a good example of how you can have characters exist in wrestling that do things that make sense, but don't necessarily translate to, you know, oh, they have to be the face of the company. Oh, they have to be the world champion. They have to be the tag team champions. It's like, no, all they have to do is establish who they are in the story, and then that will open up so many options later on down the line for other stories to be told, because then you can have that match where all of a sudden the APA show up and then the hired guns, or, you know, Crash Holly is the 24-hour champ and he needs protection for at least 24 hours because he just needs a break. So the APA are beating up everyone that shows up, but then it's like, oh, our time is over, we're out, you don't have any more money. You know, and it creates variety in storylines when you have that. I think of the G1 Climax almost, and I think of whenever Toru Yano shows up in the G1 Climax and how he's this character that kind of exists beyond the sort of mantra of what New Japan is supposed to represent. You know, they're the king of sports, and, you know, pro wrestling is considered to be at its peak going on in New Japan, and every wrestler there is performing at this highest level, and then you got this guy who's winning because of low blows and schoolboy roll-ups, and he's always deceiving the ref and always bending the rules, but it works because he's not like he's cutting promos about how he should be champion or this and that. He's just there to promote his DVD, make money, and show that he can win through his own means, you know what I mean? So that's the beauty of the APA. That's the ballad of the APA. I hope I did it justice. I hope I made people see them in a different light beyond just them beating up people and drinking beer and smoking cigars. Because that's cool too. I mean, that was fun. They did it very well. They were really good at that. But I hope it opened your mind a little bit to why it worked so well, and why they will always be one of my favorite things about that time of wrestling, but also one of my favorite things about No Mercy. And look, tag team champions coming out at once. For once I chose 2 tag teams and I actually finished with those tag teams. So that's my Let's Play. I hope you enjoy it. You'll probably be seeing some other videos, my other Let's Plays, and check out my No Mercy calls. Those are pretty cool too. And yeah, you know what to do. You've been on YouTube before. Like, comment, subscribe. I am Be Better Gamer. Until next time, thank you for watching, and keep watching all the wrestling.